Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. In the U.S., or in fact anywhere else around the world, when freedom is threatened, when liberty is under siege, it is often the artist that comes to the rescue. Not necessarily in the realm of changing politics, but in reminding us why freedom is important, inspiring us to remember what matters amidst the fear and noise of repression. Our current environment is certainly a good example. The poet William Blake talked about art as seeing the world in a grain of sand. I suppose that what he really meant was the ability to move in so tightly on something that inside of it we could construct an almost fourth dimension through which to better view the world and our experience in it. In a new book entitled It Occurs to Me That I'm an American, my guest, Jonathan Santlofer, has brought together some of the most profound artists and writers of our time to do exactly that. Jonathan Santlofer is an award-winning author and editor. His personal memoir, A Widower's Notebook, will be published later this year, and it is my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Santlofer here to talk about It Occurs to Me That I Am an American, News Stories and Art. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. What a beautiful introduction that was, just generally about, artists and their responses. I couldn't have said it better.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Tell us a little bit about how this came together, how these artists and writers came together for this volume. Give us a little background on that.
Sure. Well, actually, I asked them. I invited them. I sort of had this feeling of, what can I do? As you said, what do artists do? How do artists respond? And so I thought I'd put the word out to a bunch of writers and visual artists that I knew, though I did not know everyone in this book. Believe me, I don't know this list of amazing people. I know some of them, but the word spread, and then people even got in touch with me. And what I wanted, I didn't want the typical kind of political essays or polemic. I think there's enough of that going on right now in the world. And so I asked the writers to write stories, and the artists, everybody made something new. And I said, write something about civil liberties, what it means to be an American, what you feel is being threatened, if you're anxious, if you're angry, but put it into art form. So that's really how it came about. And then I made the very big mistake of saying, we're going to publish this on the anniversary of the Women's March, which meant we had 6 months to do it with 52 contributors. So it's been a whirlwind, but it's been pretty great, too, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Did you give them any direction or tell them certain areas to write about? One of the things I was struck by is how many focused on the issue of race in particular in one form or another.
I did not. I did give them direction, but what I said was that I said I wanted most specifically for them to think about if there was biography in some way. In other words, if it came out of their life, but that they needed to put it into story form. Their race is, I would say, probably an issue in about a third of the stories.
Right.
But, we also have dystopian stories, and we have stories about climate change, but they're all I think some of them are more subtle than others, obviously. Some are very hard-hitting, but I think we also have some really, it's hard to believe, but some very funny, laugh-out-loud stories in the book. But I specifically said to people, stories. Turn them into fiction so that people can actually enjoy this book while they are learning something, feeling something, experiencing what we're all going through, and finding a place. This is what artists do. Don't you agree, Jeff? They find a way to put their anxiety or their feelings into some kind of form. And that's what I hoped everyone would do.
Right.
I went back and forth with many different writers and artists as to what they wanted to do. And, some would send me notes and I'd say, well, maybe do a little more of this and a little less of that. But pretty much they followed their hearts. And I think that's good.
Mm-hmm. Did you say you wrote one of the essays in here, which was more, I guess, optimistic and maybe a little more hopeful? Did you have a sense that what you might wind up at the end was a pretty bleak collection that really reflected a pretty bleak picture of where we are today?
Yeah, well, for some odd reason or another, I am a somewhat optimistic guy. My optimism does get to be crushed on a daily basis, but I back up. I'm like one of those clowns, those inflatable clowns. Right. You can hit them and they fall down and they bounce back up. My essay is the introduction about what I wanted in the book, what I felt, and that I think, I think that is a kind of hopeful piece. I think I said it at the end of that I wanted the book to represent, more than just great prose and beautiful pictures, but to represent hope. I did expect some bleak stories, some bleak art images, and there are some. But as I said, there are Susan Isaacs, who became famous in the 70s for compromising positions, wrote a really, really funny story. It has a bite to it, there's no question, but it's also a very funny story. I think, I asked very diverse kinds of writers. So Mary Higgins Clark wrote a very tender story about a World War II veteran, which she was going to dedicate it to her brother who died in that war, but she decided to keep it a little more anonymous. I think Roz Chast, the New Yorker cartoonist, gives us something very funny. I think it's kind of, I don't think the book is bleak, and I hoped it wouldn't be. I don't mind when people are writing angry pieces or ones that are... Yeah, Joyce Carol Oates, if you mind if I babble on for a moment.
Sure, go ahead.
Joyce Carol Oates wrote a dystopian story, and I didn't know this until she handed it in, that she had started this piece a few years ago and put it aside. And then when I wrote to her and asked her to do this, she pulled it out and she thought, oh gosh, this is actually happening. We're really close to this. And it gave her the impetus to finish it. Now, that story, I would say, it's funny, you might call it bleak, but you read it in a shot. You know what I mean? It's so cinematic and so it's kind of 1984-ish and scary. But I'm not. I don't think the book is I don't think it's a dark book. I would say it's a hopeful book. It's a book that people are writing about. People are writing things and making images about what it means to them to be an American, what we need to preserve, what we hope to preserve, all those kind of things.
One of the things, I suppose what makes it hopeful in a sense is that it if successful, it arguably changes our point of view on the world. We may not have a hopeful view, but what it does is it gives us context. Every day we're taking in raw data, more data about what's actually happening. But what's missing from so much of that is context. And in many ways, this provides that. These stories provide that.
Oh, that's a great thing to say, and I hope that's true. I'm not sure. I say often, and I say this to writing students of mine, and that I don't think one story can change the world particularly, but I do think that when you say context, hopefully when you're reading a story or looking at a work of art, you fall into it, right? You become part of that world. So if you see that Art Spiegelman, for example, is doing these amazingly beautiful and very complex drawings of Ellis Island, it suddenly and there's writing in it. You can suddenly feel yourself inside that. Or you look at, I don't know. I'd say Elizabeth Strout's story, for example, is very quiet and very beautiful, but it feels, it's about how our lives change, what we expected, what we did get, what we didn't get. Or, you read a story by James Hannaham, which is a very strong racial story, kind of shocking at one point, but, also kind of satire. And yet, so you gasp at some of it, but at the same time, you're in this world of a black couple trying to adopt a white baby. And so it does put things like that into context. You suddenly see yourself, or Susan Isaacs, a kind of rich white woman suddenly finding herself aiding and abetting Haitian immigrants. This woman who's the first half of the story has been talking about shopping on Rodeo Drive or wherever. And you're inside her head, and it's very funny. So will it change the way people feel? Well, I hope nowadays that we can have a dialogue. If you read Susan Minot's story, Listen, right. It's just about people talking, saying different things. It's a dialogue. It's a poem. It's going to be enacted on the stage, by the way, in New York at Symphony Space with a bunch of other stories. And I think that'll be interesting to hear it. But I know that when Susan wrote it, she said she was just putting together things that she'd heard, things that people had said to her, and wanted to see how they would mix together, all these different things people are saying today. So I hope the book does have a context for people, that they read it and they think about it. It's thought-provoking, it's disturbing, it's funny, interesting, all those things.
I mean, where the context is also relevant, I suppose, and all those things that you're saying about it, is that in our environment today, it's hard to get people to talk about some of these issues head on. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of reservation, but to look at them in the context of a different kind of story might allow people to open their minds just a little bit in ways that they might not do in a more direct head-on conversation.
I think you're absolutely right. I think I think you've actually now touched on something that I felt, but I wasn't, I wasn't completely clear in my head when I first started putting the book together, but that I wanted just what you're talking about, not political essays at all, but stories that would get people thinking and being able to confront or talk about certain things, and you're right. It's very difficult. People are polarized. They're angry. There's a very kind of wild and crazy story by Walter Mosley, about this man who kind of sequesters himself inside his apartment, and he seems to be going crazy, but he's also withdrawing from the world. And, at the same time, he ends up becoming a social media star by doing that. So it's this kind of turnaround. But I wonder, a story like that, when I first read it, it was one of the first stories that came in, and I read it and I thought, gee, I wonder if this will help people if it would bring up a discussion between different people about climate change and how we talk to each other, those kind of things. So it's very much, I think, what this book is about. It's about people being able to talk. You read a story and you might tell your friend to read this story, and then you'll talk about it. And maybe you'll be on different sides of the issue, but you can talk about the story from both sides. I think that's a great thing. If one thing art can do to get people talking and thinking, then it's done a very big part of its job.
Right. Talk a little bit about the visual artists that are part of this collection.
Oh, yeah. Well, I got my training as a visual artist. I was a painter. I'm still a painter, but I really didn't start writing until later in my life. And so I very much wanted visual artists in here for some very specific reasons. I'd say one, here's the lowest level. I love picture books. I grew up as a kid I taught myself to read with comic books. So I've asked a lot of graphic novelists, like Mimi Pond, who does a hilarious thing here, or Eric Orner, who's a young graphic comic maker. I mean, he does a really funny 3-page foldout in the book about that I think is hilarious, very biting. So I have those people. I have great visual painters like Eric Fischel, who's doing a series called Late America. I had aside from just the marquee names in the book, I wanted some younger people. There's a young woman named Bridget Hawkins, and she was a student of mine in my graphic novel class at Pratt Institute, and she started doing this graphic comic about her life, about being biracial. And I just realized this is exactly something that, if someone could read it as a comic, and it would get people involved on another level. Visual art, of course, is people see it. You look at it. You don't have to read it. So we could look at paintings, and in so many ways, I think not only does it make the book beautiful, but it's a sort of simpler and more direct hit to your brain. I don't know if you looked at John Quick to See Smith, who's an American Indian. By the way, she corrected me when I said Native American. So she's an American Indian, and her paintings, which are really, I think starkly beautiful. There's a little statement she has with them about canoes and totems and the history of Native Americans and American Indians in this country. So you get to look at something really beautiful and striking, and then you start to examine it and think about it. And because I was trained as an artist and I love visual art, I kind of wanted to bring them together in one book. I thought they could play against each other. People could look at the pictures. They could take a break from the writing or go back and forth, Mm-hmm. I love the way it made the book look. I love the way the cover works, with the Jasper Johns
Right.
American flags, which to me is one of the most iconic images we have of the American flag, and that goes all the way back to the 60s. So we went after him to get use of that image for the cover, which we got. And, even the end papers are, the original Constitution. So the visual part of the book was very important to us, and I'm very happy with the way it looks. So you can as I said, you can read and look at pictures,
Right.
just the way I did when I was a kid. So
well, the difference is, it's funny you talk about the 60s, because I was thinking about it in that framework as well. And the difference was, I suppose, in the 60s, what artists brought was music. Now that's not necessarily part of the equation. It is more writing in visual art today.
Maybe so. I don't know. I can only really. There are only so many things, of course, one can know. And my two fields would be visual art and writing. I love music. I used to say to my wife that when I was really a painter, that if I went blind, I was going to teach myself to play an instrument and become a great musician, or I'd have to kill myself. And she'd say, "Oh, honey, you're tone deaf. Yeah, you have to kill yourself right away." But in any case, music. I think the 60s also was a time when. By the way, that was supposed to be a joke, Jeff.
Yes,
I really went over very, very poorly,
No.
but okay. I want to, say that I think the 60s are somewhat analogous in terms of, reactions and rebellion and a lot of talk and a lot of conflict. I didn't keep that in mind necessarily when I was putting this book together. But, I think there are periods in our history, in our lives, when particularly different kinds of artists are galvanized, right? Mm-hmm. I couldn't put music in this book. I wouldn't know where to start, but it would surely be nice to have a CD to play, right? But you're right. The folk singing, and that was coming out of these would be a whole different thing. Also, I guess our world is so large at this point.
Right.
I was limiting myself, of course, to Americans for this book. too. You could be many of the people are immigrants who have become Americans, like Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote the introduction, beautiful introduction. Or I asked Lee Child, who's British, but considers himself an immigrant. He said that the other night on a panel we had. But, one of probably our most successful crime writers who wrote a beautiful story about expatriatism and a hate crime. Mm-hmm. So I don't think I answered your question there.
No,
Jeff.
That's fine.
Sorry about that.
Was there anybody that said no to doing this?
Well, here's the funny part. I sent out a big list of requests to different people, and I didn't hear from a lot of them for a while. So I sent another list. And then the next thing I knew, so many of the people had said yes, which is why we ended up with more than 50 contributors. But there were people who said no. Most of them, I would say all of the people who said no, they said it because they either were going to be on a book tour for the next 6 months, or they were not going to be in the country. They didn't say no because they didn't want to. They all said, I would love to be in this, but in any case, I did end up with more people than I expected, and it made the book sort of difficult to pull together in such a short amount of time. But I surely could not be happier with the people who have ended up participating in this book. It's an extraordinary group, and not a diva among them. They all got their work in on time, and they, that was pretty something, because I had a few sleepless nights, but beyond that, not so much.
Great. The book is It Occurs to Me That I Am America, New Stories and New Art, an original collection of stories and art about the American experience. Jonathan, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
It was very nice to do that, and I thank you, Jeff, for asking me to.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.